A partnership of equals. That was France's promise this week when its president met more than 30 African heads of state at a summit in Nairobi, Kenya. France has been trying to reset its relationship with Africa for years. It's withdrawn its troops from Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger. Not by choice. Those governments asked it to leave. But it's also tried to move on from what's being called France-Afrique, a system of influence that looked less like a partnership and more like control. But according to President Emmanuel Macron and his host, Kenya's President Ruto, it's time for a new era.
Basically, we are not wanting to provide aid. That approach has been abandoned. And besides, as you can see, many northern states are no longer providing the aid that was initially planned. Some for ideological reasons, others due to budgetary constraints. This is a reality. We can't hide behind it. Therefore, we must rethink the North-South relationship with clear-sightedness.
We are recalibrating our relationship with our partners. And we have been absolutely clear that this is a relationship of equals. At the heart of this relationship is sovereign equality. At the heart of this relationship is not extraction, is not exploitation.
Let's bring in Chris Ogunmodede, visiting fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Chris, it's good to speak to you again. President Macron came to Nairobi with this pledge of 23 billion euros and the phrase partnership of equals. When you look at this, is there do you see a genuine change of orientation, or is it just simply a case of rebranding?
I see it as a case of rebranding. I don't see a genuine desire by the French government and specifically President Macron to do things differently on the African continent. What I'm seeing is a country and a leader whose nation is deeply unpopular in one part of the African continent, in West Africa, where I work and live, and is simply pivoting elsewhere. Now, you might argue that what's wrong with that? That why, when you recognize, you have losses somewhere, why not pivot elsewhere? The challenge with that is that the French government and Macron specifically is trying to present its newfound, well, not so newfound in that sense, but its desire to pivot elsewhere and sort of reestablish its footing on the African continent as a new beginning. Whereas when you look at the substance and the symbolism of everything they're doing, it's, at best, it's lipstick on a pig.
And not just about Macron, but France as a whole. There seems to have been this shift in public sentiment in Africa relating to France in particular, as you mentioned, in West Africa. What's behind that?
Yeah, I've talked about this for so many years on many platforms, including this one. And, my answer is always the same. Like the substance of French policy is what's driving this, because the French policymakers, for instance, tend to believe two things. This is the Russians. This is all happening because of, Russian disinformation and what they call anti-colonial sentiment, anti-French sentiment. Sometimes they lump it into Pan-Africanism, depending on who the speaker is. But, there is the belief among French commentators, French policymakers, that this is all sort of an irrational outburst, driven by anti-colonialism and Russian disinformation. It cannot be because of the substance of French policy toward their countries, in which also includes French support for really, frankly, terrible governments that have rigged elections, that have abused human rights, have been caught up in some, terrible act of corruption. It can't be any of this. It's just the anti-colonial sentiment. It's the anti-Russian, it's the Russian propaganda and all of these things. So there is a lack of, introspection and accountability when it comes to French policy that makes me see what they're doing in East Africa rather as, a little insincere.
Macron's been all over the continent recently. He's made lots of trips, and there's all this French investment going into Africa as well. And he, being the first French president born in the post-colonial period, has been keen to actually point that that time is past and we can start afresh. And there's also needs to be responsibility taken on by post-colonial African leaders for the state of the continent as well, not just blaming things on colonialism. What's your response to that? Because he seems to be trying to move France forward in Africa.
No one wants to move forward more than Africans ourselves. No one wants to move into more prosperity. No one wants to, get beyond the lingering effects of colonial rule, the transatlantic slave trade, military dictatorships, and all of the multitude of developments that have afflicted this continent for about 500 years thereabout. No one wants that more than Africans. No one wants to hold their leaders to account more, and we see this literally every time. So whenever I hear this rhetoric from French policymakers and others who say things like, oh, stop blaming colonialism, stop blaming the West, take accountability for your actions, hold your leaders to account. My response is, well, they do that all the time. And very often they get shot in the streets, usually by European-made weapons, Western weapons, by troops who are backed by Western governments, including France. So, you can't have it both ways. At some point, we have to be really sincere and have to be, frankly, accurate about the things we talk about. And there should be some level of introspection, even if you want to insist that a certain, part of the debate isn't, holding its own feet to the fire. I think you should be willing to do that yourself. And I've seen no evidence that the French government is willing to do that.
Is this a problem of the messenger? Macron being, for example, saying this, like you said, not many people have a problem or disagree with the sentiment. Is the issue then the messenger? And how would you say this reflects on where the Africa versus West relationship should go?
Well, I'll take the first question. It's both. It's both the message and the messenger. Regardless of who the French president is, things like France-Afrique would still be a thing. And France-Afrique, just for those who don't know, it's a system. It's a neo-colonial system of relations between France and its former colonies in Africa. That would very much still be a thing, regardless of who the president is, despite everything Macron has talked about. Oh, we're trying to move beyond that. But, when things get very hard, the French tend to default to that. So it very much will be a thing, regardless of who the president. But it's also specific to Macron himself in terms of the things he has said and done over the, almost decade that he's been the French president. So as I say, it's a bit of both the messenger and the message. As to the other part of the question, I wouldn't even frame it as Africa versus the West, because as I regularly point out on these media hits, when you look at the countries that, African nations, both individually and collectively as a continent, that they regard highly, many of them are Western. Even in West Africa, for instance, people always say things like, oh, there is anti-Western sentiment in West Africa, but time and again, surveys and, other forms of quantitative data reveal that West Africans actually have, they find other countries very popular, such as the United States, such as Germany, such as Great Britain. So it's not an anti-Western sentiment. People have a specific challenge with French policy. And I'm specific about French policy because French citizens themselves live very freely. They live very happily. They live in the best neighborhoods in West African cities. People defer to them. People treat them very well. So there is no anti-Western sentiment on the African continent in any part. What people have a challenge with is specific policies, both from their own nations as well as the support they render to our governments on the continent.
Very clearly put, Chris. Chris Ogunmodede, thank you very much for speaking to us.
Thank you.